Welcome, everyone, to what I have been told by our Ukrainian students is the 364th of February. For us, February 22nd, 1 year since Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I'm Dr. Jeanette Fregulia. I'm the chair of the history department. I need papers to remind me of that. I'm the chair of the history department here at Carroll and your moderator this evening. My one experience in the part of the world under discussion tonight was the winter of 1984, when the weather was much as it is right now here in Helena, and it seems apropos. We appreciate you joining us for an examination of Russia's war against Ukraine, including its origins, the tragic events of the past year, and the potential consequences, not just for Ukraine and Russia, but also for the US, Europe, indeed the entire world. Allow me to introduce those that you actually came to hear. But first, I would like to acknowledge that President John II and his wife Victoria have joined us this evening as well. So, and I think we have host families also.
Yeah.
We also have host families from our Ukrainian students here, so I'd like to welcome all of you. Dr. Dean Pavlakis received his PhD from the State University of New York at Buffalo, completing fields in modern European history, modern British history, and Atlantic history. Here at Carroll, he's an associate professor of modern Europe and sub-Saharan Africa and teaches our class on the history of Russia. Dr. DJ Cash earned his PhD from Boston University, and here at Carroll is the department's expert on US history, with particular emphasis on US political theory and foreign relations. And we are proud to report that he has a forthcoming book, The Forgotten Debate, Public Opinion Journals, the Korean War, and the Roots of America's Ideological Division. Dr. Jeremy Johnson is the chair of the Political Science and International Relations Department and holds a doctorate from Brown University. His areas of expertise include US national government, public policy, social welfare policy, and health policy. He is also an honorary member of the history department. We are joined especially tonight by three of our students from the Ukraine. Anzhela Stoliar. Wait, thank you. Mariia Savchenko. And prior to coming to Carroll, they both attended Black Sea National University in Mykolaiv. We're also joined by Veronika Fomishyna, who was enrolled at Comenius National University in Bratislava in the Czech Republic. After the presentation, there will be time for questions from both the audience and those joining us virtually. I will see you all again after. Thank you.
All right, well, good evening. I have the unenviable job of giving you 1,000 years of Ukrainian history in very few minutes. Can you hear me okay? I don't have to shout. Great. So, just as a reminder, this is where Ukraine is in Europe. But the origin story goes all the way back 1,000 years to a set of political entities referred to as Kievan Rus. And this is the origin story, not just for Ukraine, not just for Russia, but also for Belarus. The East Slavic peoples lived in this area. They had a civilization heavily influenced by the Byzantine Empire and by Scandinavia, and developed a thriving network of city-states loosely under the control of what we have called up until this last year, Kiev, now Kyiv in Ukrainian. This civilization lasted for several hundred years until it was smashed by the Mongol invasion. Mongols conquered, there we go, just about the whole area, except for that city up in the north called Novgorod, which managed to maintain an independent political existence, came tribute to the Mongols, and developed into a merchant republic similar to the merchant republics of the Hanseatic League on the Baltic and North Seas. The Mongol grip weakened over our time, and by 1400, the Rus principalities had divided into 3 groups. First of all, and the largest, was what was controlled by Poland-Lithuania. Kingdom of Poland, Central European Kingdom, brought what is now Belarus and part of Ukraine under the umbrella of this European kingdom, with its complex set of rights, responsibilities, powerful nobility, a reciprocal civil society, obviously dominated by the rich. I forgot to point out that in the south of what is now Ukraine, and you can see Ukraine traced on that map, you see the Mongols continue to control that area. That area could not be easily farmed. Soil was too hard and had to wait for more modern farming techniques, modern plows, oxen, horses, before it could be farmed. So it was very sparsely populated and mostly used by nomadic herdsmen. By bringing Poland bringing Belarus and Ukraine into its orbit, they grafted their existing civilization onto Central European civilization. Very different situation in the north. Novgorod continued to exist as a merchant republic. When we say merchant republic, top government officials chosen by merchant families, again, a complex set of civic life, and an interesting argument about where sovereignty comes from. And then we have the state of Muscovy. The city of Moscow's rulers at this time got the privilege from the Mongols of collecting tribute from the surrounding city-states. And this enabled Muscovy, to grow much more powerful, and it gradually absorbed those surrounding states and declared its independence from the Mongols. But what's important to understand about its political life is that Muscovy, in the words of Yale professor Tim Snyder, is a Mongol successor state. In other words, its political institutions are not those of Kiev and Rus, not those of Novgorod, not those of Central Europe, but rather sovereignty administered the way the Mongols did, which is the person at the head of the government controls everything. It is an autocracy. All property is linked to the government. There is no civil society. The nobility serves at the pleasure of the monarch. So these are 3 separate political models. Any one of which could have ended up becoming the model for the 3 Slavic peoples, or in fact, they could have developed separately. But what happened is Muscovy kept getting stronger. They smashed Ukraine, they smashed Novgorod in 1478, and made a point of destroying the library, the city archives, and all symbols of the republic that had existed before. 80% of the land was drawn into Muscovy as the property of the Tsar. So we have very different destinies arriving for these people. So this is the situation we get around 1500. And one of the interesting things that develops is in the place, and I will take this pointer, where the 3 areas meet, Muscovy, Poland, Lithuania, and the Mongols. That area becomes a place of creativity. People escape from both the domination of Poland and further east, the domination of Muscovy, and develop their own first-born civilization. We refer to these people as the Cossacks. And they develop an autonomous polity. The Ukrainian Cossacks, called the Zaporizhian Cossacks, develop an autonomous polity within Poland and Lithuania. At its height, it controlled much of what we now know as Ukraine. But they made a fateful decision. In the 1600s, in a dispute with the King of Poland, the leaders of the Cossack state turned to Muscovy and asked for their protection. And Muscovy said, sure, as long as we're sovereign, you can maintain your autonomous political traditions, which lasted about 50 years. And then it was just simply absorbed into Muscovy. All right? Now, moving into the next century, we are racing through history here. Various Russian rulers, but especially Catherine the Great, divide up Poland, taking the territory of Ukraine, which they refer to as Little Russia, as well as that area down to the Black Sea that had not been inhabited. Now, with modern farming techniques, it could become a rich agricultural zone. This is referred to as New Russia, Novorossiya, a term that Putin has used through this discussion. And Novorossiya needed to be colonized. It was colonized by a large number of different kinds of people, but primarily by Ukrainians, right, from the northwest, and by Russians from the northeast. Filling this territory and creating a complex linguistic map, which, if you've heard of it, has probably confused you. So I'm going to jump to the present and just point out the impact of this history on the ethno-linguistic. This, of course, is an approximation, but it gives you an idea. The red and pink areas are predominantly Ukrainian speaking and have always identified as Ukrainian. The yellow, both the lighter color and the brighter yellow, indicate areas that are primarily Russian speaking, but also among those Russian speaking people, primarily identify as Ukrainian. The stripes on the right-hand side indicate that there is also a sizable Russian-speaking population that identifies as Russian. This was also true for the majority of the population in the territory of the Crimea, which was settled almost exclusively by Russians. Of course, in the Crimea, there was already a dense population, fairly dense, of descended from the Mongols, as well as Greeks and Armenians who had lived there since ancient. Right? Now, this gives you a sense, as if you can think of what you know about the war in Ukraine, it is primarily, especially since those first months, been fought in the east and the south. And this is the territory, this Russian-speaking territory that Putin has always particularly had his eye on in terms of his war. Well, under Russia, Ukraine is a province of the Russian Empire, which, by the way, took the name Russia in 1721. Up until that point, it is Muscovy. But the country deliberately adopts the name Russia to claim that it is the successor state of all the former Rus people from ancient times. Of course, that's simplifying an incredibly complex story because we've got multiple different cultures and by now languages among those three people. Ukraine was briefly, you can't really see my titles very well anymore, briefly independent in the chaos at the end of World War I and the Russian Revolution, and claimed territory that roughly corresponds to the modern Ukrainian state. But in 1920, the Red Army swept in and annexed Ukraine as the Ukrainian Soviet State Police Republic, claiming that it was one of the first of a collection of nations that would eventually become a worldwide collective called the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. So that did not become worldwide. The Bolshevik Revolution did not spread across the world, but Ukraine is among the first of the republics in the Soviet Union. This did not work out very well for Ukraine, particularly in the 1930s. In the 1930s, Joseph Stalin undertook a collectivization of agriculture across the USSR. This did not go very well and led to very repressive policies. None so repressive as those policies followed in Ukraine. And eventually word leaked out. And what had happened is Stalin's people, his officials, had been sent to roam Ukraine, gathering all the food, not just the food produced, but seed corn, animals, etc., leaving the people of this rich agricultural area to starve. And this is referred to by the Ukrainians as the Holodomor. It is, from our perspective, a man-made famine imposed on this part of the country. It affects other parts of the Soviet Union, but none so serious in here. The estimate at the time was that 6 million had died of this man-made famine. The estimates among scholars vary tremendously. There are some people who say it's a little less than it. There's some people who say that many millions more. But when you think about Ukraine's relationship to this larger entity, you have to keep in mind the trauma of this famine. Fast forward a mere 4 or 5 years. In 1941, the Nazis invaded the Soviet Union, and they were particularly interested in getting their hands on Ukraine. Given what the Ukrainians had gone through, you will not be surprised to hear that a significant portion of the Ukrainian people thought that the Nazis would be better than Stalin. Welcoming them, trying to collaborate with them, etc. They were quickly disabused of this notion. Hitler's plans for Ukraine and Belarus and the parts of Russia he conquered involved, and this is documented, a third of the people dying within a couple of years. The remaining people were to work as slave laborers until they perished. So, most Ukrainians very quickly turned against the Nazis. A proportion continued to collaborate. And this is the origin story of what we may have heard of Putin's claim that somehow the modern Ukrainian state is dominated by neo-Nazis, descended from these Nazis at that time. This has no bearing in reality. Like every country, Ukraine has had neo-Nazi groups, right? It's like the United States, just like Germany, just like other places. But they have in no way dominated Ukrainian state. In fact, over 4 million Ukrainians voluntarily joined Stalin's army to fight Germany after they realized what Germany had. From the end of the war to the Cold War, Ukraine remained part of the Soviet Union. In lighter red, you see the Soviet satellite states. Cold War wraps up at the end of the 80s. In 1991, the Soviet Union disintegrated into its component parts. Like the other republics of the Soviet Union, Ukraine became independent. The end of the Cold War also led to Putin's first grievance, and that is the expansion of NATO, the alliance that had been created in 1949 to defend Europe against Soviet aggression. Now you see formerly neutral countries and former Soviet satellites, and indeed 3 former Soviet republics joining this alliance. This is a grievance constantly commented on by Putin. This was a hostile act by the West. It was certainly directed at at Russia by those states that had been under Soviet domination. They wanted to join NATO in case Russia would ever become territorially aggressive again. Putin's second grievance also has its roots in recent history, and that is 2 popular revolutions against, if I may simplify, a man who symbolized Putin-style rule, okay, a corrupt, semi-authoritarian, non-democratic rule. Viktor Yanukovych represented that future for Ukraine. The Ukrainians rejected him in a popular uprising in 2004 called the Orange Revolution. Then subsequently elected him as president and turned against him, and in the Maidan Revolution rebelled and ultimately drove him out of the country. This is Putin's second grievance. Both the first and second grievances are deemed by Putin to be inspired, no, in fact, orchestrated by the American government with the help of other governments in Europe. So I leave you now with a sense of Ukrainian history and a sense of where some of the energy behind the invasion comes from. And I will turn it over to Dr. Cash. Oh.
I don't think I need this. Can you guys hear me? Fine. I do need it? Oh. Okay. Better? Okay. Well, thank you all for coming this evening. Thank you, Dr. Pavlakis, for taking the lead in organizing this. I've decided to honor President Zelensky tonight by dressing down. See, show you an image of him later that looks very much like me, except he has more hair than I do. But, and also to our Ukrainian students, I'd like to say I hope that the people of Montana have welcomed you more warmly than our weather has. Okay. So here we are. This was 2 days ago. You might have seen this in the news. President Biden on a surprise visit to Kyiv, standing there with President Zelensky. And this was President Biden's quote. 1 year later, because we're 1 year into the war here, 1 year later, Kyiv stands and Ukraine stands, democracy stands. That's how President Biden summed up the situation after 1 year of war in Ukraine. So what I'm going to do, my job tonight is to sort of give you a broad overview. Dr. Pavlakis had to deal with 1,000 years of history in 10 minutes. I'm only going to do 100 years, so much easier for me. I'm going to give you sort of a broad overview of some major themes in the history of U.S. foreign policy, particularly as it concerns Europe, and then how U.S. foreign policy intersects with U.S.-Russian relations, U.S.-Ukrainian relations today. First, a very quick disclaimer. Again, I'm going to be focusing primarily on Europe, on the history of U.S. foreign policy in Europe, which is largely positive, which is largely premised on the support of and defense of democracy. So that's kind of the history I'm going to be taking you through. I do want to point out that is not U.S. foreign policy in more universal terms. If we look at places like Latin America, Asia, the Middle East, U.S. foreign policy is not quite so inspiring as it has been over the last 100 years in Europe. Okay, the place where I'll begin, it's too bad we can't see the titles too well here. Here is Woodrow Wilson delivering an address before a joint session of Congress in 1917. This is when when President Wilson asked Congress for a declaration of war against the German Empire in World War I. This is when Wilson kind of creates the ideology that most of us, at least most of us as Americans, like to think of when we think of American foreign policy, that this is what motivates us, right? Defense of democracy. This is where that idea largely comes from Woodrow Wilson in 1917. This was the point of World War I for Woodrow Wilson. This is what the United States was up to, was protecting, preserving democracy in the world. If we fast forward again, I'm going to have to sort of speed through a lot of this. If we fast forward then to the Second World War, here we are before the U.S. actually enters the war. Pearl Harbor was December 1941. So this is before the U.S. is in the war, but Franklin Roosevelt did his best to supply Britain with the weapons necessary to defend themselves against Hitler and the Nazis. Roosevelt described that situation as the United States being the great arsenal of democracy. So again, the US isn't fighting directly quite yet. They're supporting Britain, later the Soviet Union as well. But Roosevelt viewed this as sending weapons to Britain, who was on the front lines of the fight for democracy in the world. Just a few months later then, Roosevelt and Churchill get together, Churchill the prime minister, of Britain, and they signed the Atlantic Charter, which was basically a vision for a democratic Europe post-war. So Roosevelt, again, the United States isn't even in the war yet, but Roosevelt is here agreeing with Winston Churchill that this is what we want the world to look like after the war is over, after we defeat Hitler. We want Europe to be a place where peoples can determine their own fate, can elect their own systems of government. Again, a future democratic order in Europe. After the war is over then, the United States and Soviet Union have emerged as not just great powers, but superpowers. This is the dawn of the Cold War, and the United States and Soviet Union are going to square off for the next 40 to 50 years. And at the beginning of the Cold War, this is what then President Truman had to say in what came to be known as the Truman Doctrine. This is the doctrine of containment. The United States would contain Soviet communism. And this is kind of the most important nugget from the Truman Doctrine speech. It must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or outside pressures. In reality, this is targeting the Soviet Union. This is targeting the expansion of communism. President Truman is saying, we, the United States, are going to be the world's policeman against communist expansion. Anytime communism threatens to expand, we will step in and use whatever means we have at our disposal, political, economic, ultimately military, to contain communism from expanding. On that military note, NATO is one of the tools that winds up largely successfully enforcing the Truman Doctrine. So NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, is this mutual defense pact. It's a military alliance between the United States and Canada, and then the treaties you see in blue on the map in Europe. So this is kind of the militarization of containment. Again, these countries banding together out of mutual fear of Soviet expansionism. Throughout the rest of the Cold War, then, we get numerous glimpses of American presidents doing inspiring things in Europe. One of the examples of that is with John F. Kennedy, who visits West Berlin in 1963. This is right after the Berlin crisis, after the construction of the Berlin Wall. If you don't know too much about this period, West Berlin was kind of this tiny little island of democracy floating in a vast communist sea. So Kennedy goes to West Berlin to sort of shore up the morale of the people of West Berlin. And in very imperfect German, Kennedy says, Ich bin ein Berliner, I am a Berliner. The message here is everyone around the world who loves freedom, we are all Berliners, right? I am a Berliner. So he's sending this message to the people of West Berlin, stand strong, we the United States are with you. Several decades later then, we get Ronald Reagan towards the end of the Cold War, showing up in the exact same spots, standing right there in front of Brandenburg Gate at the Berlin Wall, where he throws down the gauntlets to Mikhail Gorbachev, the premier of the Soviet Union, saying basically, Mr. Gorbachev, if you are sincere about your desire to reform, then tear down this wall. So a challenge to liberate East Germany and East Berlin in particular. Okay, now, I don't want to give you the impression that Ronald Reagan thundered forth like Zeus from Olympus and then the wall came down. It was a little more complicated than that. But in the interest of time, we have to go kind of quickly here. So my next slide then is about the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, which Dr. Pavlakis already mentioned. And part of that disintegration of the Soviet Union was, of course, Ukraine becoming an independent republic. Also, as Dr. Pavlakis mentioned, what we see then in the decade or two to come is slow but steady NATO expansion, including many territories, many countries that used to be in the Soviet orbit during the Cold War. So if we look east of Germany there, you can see Poland in particular, the Baltics, which were actually part of the Soviet Union itself, not just satellites, and then other former Soviet satellites down throughout Eastern Europe, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, etc. So as Dr. Pavlakis pointed out, this did not necessarily sit well with Vladimir Putin. Speaking of Putin, he comes to power in the year 2000. So yeah, Vladimir Putin's been in power for over 20 years. There were 4 years he was prime minister rather than president, is that right? But he was still basically running the show. So he's basically been in charge of Russia for 23 years and counting. Shortly after he takes power, I believe it was 2005, Putin gave a famous speech in which he basically said that the collapse of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. So Putin sort of laid his cards on the table in many ways there in terms of how he felt about Russian history, that it was a catastrophe for Putin that the Soviet Union disintegrated and that what he's more recently called historical Russia had receded, right? And that includes, of course, Ukraine in Putin's view. Okay, for some of these reasons, particularly the expansion of NATO, there was tension growing between the United States and Russia during the first decade of the 21st century. One possible bright spot in that relationship was the signing of a nuclear arms deal, the New START Treaty signed in 2010. There's former President Obama and then President Medvedev instead of Putin. That's when Putin was prime minister, which is why Medvedev is there. But this was a sign of possible future cooperation, right? These two countries were going to continue to reduce their nuclear stockpiles. As you may have seen in the news, Vladimir Putin withdrew from this yesterday. Okay, speaking of tension, as Dr. Pavlakis alluded to, it's not just the Ukrainian revolutions that Putin blames the United States for, but he was very angry about pro-democracy protests in Russia itself, 2011, 2012, 2013. And President Putin was specifically very upset with then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. He blamed her for kind of urging on these pro-democracy protesters in Russia, sort of orchestrating this anti-Putin movement in Russia. Putin would not forget that. Okay, as Dr. Pavlakis mentioned, we get a pro-Western revolution in Ukraine in 2014. This does not please Vladimir Putin. Note the date, February 2014. The very next month is when the Russians moved in and annexed the Crimea. So Putin reacted almost immediately to this revolution in Ukraine, grabbing Crimea as part of Russia. Okay, now I mentioned a few minutes ago that Putin would not easily forgive Hillary Clinton for what he blamed her for, which was the encouraging those democracy protests. And so Putin, one way he decided to get his revenge was by trying to sink her presidential candidacy. So as we know, Russia used social media, false information and so forth, spread around to try to influence the 2016 election, which ultimately was won by Donald Trump. Oh, I should point out, sorry, go back a slide here, that it's in the wake of the annexation of Crimea that the United States begins to give limited military aid to Ukraine, not the kind of aid it's been giving over the last year, but a little bit of military aid, which incidentally was the aid that was at stake with the situation that led to the first impeachment of Donald Trump when he tried to withhold that aid from Ukraine. Okay, more recently, since the war began a year ago, the US and its NATO partners have dramatically increased their military assistance to Ukraine. There's President Zelensky, I told you I was dressed like him, right? There's President Zelensky speaking before a joint session of Congress. If I ever get the honor to speak before Congress, I will wear a sweater, I promise. So there's Zelensky speaking before Congress, the Ukrainian cause has been embraced, generally speaking, I think, by American popular opinion, certainly by Congress, by President Biden. And so that's kind of how we wind up where we are with Biden visiting Kyiv and making this claim that I think is in line with traditional US foreign policy towards Europe, that the United States is going to stand on the side of democracy, especially against Russian aggression. Thank you, Dr. Jones.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I'm going to address 4 main points tonight. One, a general overview explaining the course of the war over the last year, which contrary to many expert opinions has turned into a protracted slog. 2, why sanctions are still not an effective tool to pressure Russia to change course. 3, how the war has changed Russian society. And 4, where political and public opinion in the United States is now. So, number 1, originally expert opinion, the predictions were that the Russian military, hold down a little bit, yeah, I hardly ever talk to microphones, this is really not what I do. So, originally, the Russian military suggested that there would be a quick Russian victory in a matter of days. Which no doubt the Russians expected as well. The original war plan seen in the first map shows that Russians expected to quickly seize Kyiv in a matter of days, and the Russians did originally seize some territory, as shown on the second map. That, of course, did not happen. The Russian army immediately got mired down in the invasion. Remember how the much vaunted 40-mile Russian convoy essentially turned into a massive, failed logistical experience? That was emblematic of how Russian forces in Ukraine showed no evidence of a unified command. They never achieved air superiority, and there was a lack of any effective encrypted system. The Russian army behavior in Ukraine is characterized by looting, poor organization, and a lack of discipline. Ukrainians pushed Russians away from Kyiv in late spring. Later in 2022, the Ukrainians were able to launch counterattacks. So there you can see some of the offense in that map. And they reclaimed land, although the war certainly has turned into a long, protracted grind, as indicated by the final maps. In short, the war in Ukraine, as stated by the Washington Post, has largely changed from an invasion on multiple fronts to a conflict of attrition across a 600-mile front in the south and the east. And here we are in February. How could the Russian military so clearly fail to meet expectations? There were warning signs. The Russian army had a lot of difficulty in Georgia in 2008. Experts thought that Russians have resolved those military problems through reform. That turns out not to be the case. There is no doubt that the political and economic corruption so rooted in the Russian government has spillover effects in terms of the lackluster military performance. For example, often Putin's subordinates have no incentive to be truthful or critical for fear of reprisals from Putin. Also, as a professor of military strategic studies, Philip O'Brien has said notes, winning a modern war is about production and logistics. It's not about decisive victories on the battlefield by brilliant generals. World War II was already that way of not having big victories on the battlefield. It was logistics and production, and it's ever more so as we get into the 21st century. Obviously, Russia, despite the bellicosity and the machismo, was unable to execute logistically, particularly as assistance from the West began to come to Ukraine even if that assistance could be late or less than originally promised. 2, sanctions. As is typical throughout history, sanctions have failed to convince Russia to alter strategy. There was hope that the battery of sanctions imposed by Western nations at the outset of the war, including freezing a large portion of the Russians' hard currency reserves, would mean that this time might be different. As we did see that the entire Russian banking system was teetering, the ruble crashed, and Russia was clearly suffering from a loss of Western exports. Nonetheless, Russia was resilient. After the initial shock, death maneuvering by its central bank stabilized the banking system in ruble. The bank hiked the main interest rate to 20% and imposed draconian restrictions on currency exchanges, transfers, and withdrawals overseas. Russia's oil and gas exports, which Europe is very dependent on, continue to at least partially flow. There was a rebound in trade with China and other countries, which has allowed some banned technology, including computer chips, to sneak back into Russia. The sanctions were leaky. So possibly new restrictions placed on Russian oil will continue to keep hurting the Russian economy. There's evidence that many Russian households are facing financial hardship because there's been a significant drop in retail spending. Clearly, the sanctions have created more suffering for Russian households of modest means than the oligarchs. In good part because sanctions were never ramped up on natural resource exports. The recent restrictions on Russian oil are a start, but more would need to be done on that dimension. It's important to note that the total Russian economy has probably contracted less in the previous year than the double-digit contraction predicted of 10% or more by experts. All official data, though, coming from Russia is no doubt manipulated. Also, it is important to note that Ukraine's economy has contracted significantly over the last year, probably by more than 30%. This creates enormous financial hardship for the people of Ukraine. At best, the Western aid provided so far to Ukraine helps, but not enough to come anywhere near reversing the enormous economic devastation brought by the war. The bottom line is that sanctions have wounded, but by no means destroyed, the Russian military and the Russian economy. They have not convinced Putin to withdraw or end the invasion. 3, one of the biggest disappointments in the last year has been how the war has allowed Putin to quash dissent and effectively impose a repressive regime in Russia. The hope that the Russian people might collectively rise up and say no to Putin is not what is happening. If one remembers in school reading the ancient Greek historian Thucydides' account of the Peloponnesian War in the 5th century BC, a lesson was just how corrosive propaganda is for undermining the moral and governmental underpinnings of a society. People just began to believe that right is wrong, that what is wrong is right, what is black is white, and words don't mean what they mean. We see what is happening now in Russia, the inability to discern fact from fiction is happening throughout Russia. The rhetoric of denazifying Ukraine is absurd. However, after hearing this type of language repeatedly, a sufficient number of people in Russia appear open to believing the lies and fiction coming out of the mouth of the leader. Putin grabs onto nationalistic symbols of Russia from Germany in World War II to Peter the Great and the Third Rome. This is a language to try to instill loyalty in the Russian people. Putin wants the people to believe in the righteousness of the cause, even when the war is going far worse than he indicated a year ago. Putin's arguments are nonsense, but children in Russia now learn the Russian military has always liberated humanity from aggressors who seek world domination, and the crackdown on artistic and rights and freedom in Russia. Putin appears to be winning at this propaganda efforts. Russia has become increasingly unsafe for advocates of democracy and peace, political dissidents, and critics of Putin. The country has adopted stricter laws internally that makes any sort of dissent dangerous and socially unacceptable. For example, The foreign agent law now threatens criminal punishment for anyone who is deemed by the government to be under foreign influence. Many are fleeing the country while those who remain have to stay quiet. As the number of Russian casualties continue to mount over the previous year, Putin drafted a large number of new soldiers, which could mean simply grabbing men from the street, which also led to a further exodus from Russia by individuals with a vested interest in seeing regime change in Russia. Losing this slice of the Russian population creates great difficulty in changing Russian society. Russians who are refugees are looked on with suspicion both inside and outside of Russia. Polls directly asking questions to Russians about the war are essentially meaningless because it's not reasonable to expect that people would share criticisms of the war with a pollster, given the criminal penalties for dissent. The Russian Orthodox Church has become an ally in these nationalistic ambitions, which is creating new fault lines across the entire Orthodox community. The Patriarch of Moscow is at some level challenging the primacy of the Patriarch of Constantinople in the whole Orthodox world. What is not talked about enough is other Russian imperial ambitions, including the Moscow Patriarch trying to supplant the Patriarch of Alexandria in Africa as the main source of religious influence and political and economic influence on that continent. Russia is now isolated from the West. We saw Putin just pulled out of the last nuclear treaty, as mentioned by Dr. Cash, New START the other day. This isolation may allow for even more pressure to not conform with international laws and treaties. Fourth and final point, the opinion of Ukraine is unsettled in the United States. After a vast show of initial unity, we see opposition has arisen from some quarters to continued American support for Ukraine. For instance, a prominent Republican on Twitter wrote, "Zelensky is basically an ungrateful international welfare queen." Some of this articulated opposition comes down to tribalism. Many Republicans are going to oppose the President Biden, particularly when the president strongly states he's in support of a position. That is reflective partisan polarization, a staple of American politics in recent years. However, I believe the opposition to American intervention runs far deeper than a simple snapback. There's a clear generational divide within the Republican Party, with older elected officials far more willing to support the idea of American intervention in Ukraine compared to younger elected officials. Certainly much of the opposition in the United States to American intervention in Ukraine is driven by the grassroots. Clearly, today's Republican Party is no longer the Bush-Cheney Republican Party. In a recent Pew Research poll, 26% now say the U.S. is providing too much support for Ukraine, 31% say it's giving the right amount, and 20% would like to see the U.S. give Ukraine additional assistance, with Republicans being less supportive than Democrats overall. With Republicans holding a slim majority in the U.S. House, Democrats holding a slim majority in the Senate, and a Democratic president, all sorts of potential scenarios could play out in the coming months. As with everything else in the war in Ukraine, stay tuned as we move into the second year of the war. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Anzhela Stoliar, and if you can understand, I'm from Ukraine. And today is almost a year since Russia attacked Ukraine. And today is almost a year since my country has been fighting for our common values: independence, sovereignty, and freedom. My family knows what it means to lose their freedom. I grew up in Kherson region, in a village which is 10 minutes from the city of Kherson. And when the war started, I was studying in Mykolaiv, which is only 1 hour from my hometown. But my parents and my little brother remained in our village. And I haven't been able to return to my home for more than a year, because on 6th of March, Kherson was occupied. And this picture that you can see on the slide, my brother sent me after several explosions. And Kherson is a Russian-speaking city. So Russia hoped to get support and warm welcome for people there. But instead of this, they got resistance, as you can see on the next slide. But these protests were stopped after a few days. Russian soldiers used tear gas, gunshots, and intimidation to cut off water, heat, and electricity. In addition, they took all foods from the stores and destroyed it to force people to take their humanitarian aid. And now I want you to imagine your everyday life like this. You wake up in the morning and go to work. But while you're waiting for the bus, you can see how missiles are being launched or fall on the other side of the road. When you sit in the bus, the driver gives you the order to smile and say good morning to people who took you home and destroyed your normal life. When you come to the shop, you can buy only Russian products. All of them are low quality, with prices 3 or 4 times higher than before the war. When you go home, Russian soldiers, depending on their moods, can ask you to buy them pizza or beer, or they won't let you go further. If you're a Ukrainian child, you are secretly studying Ukrainian school online, because now it's forbidden to attend Ukrainian public schools. You hear explosions every day, and you get used to them, so now you even don't pay attention. One day, you realize that you cannot call anyone, and you feel that you cut off from the outside world, because Russians shut down all mobile and internet communications. You don't know anymore who can be trusted. Your neighbors or your friends can disappear. Some of them you will see again, but skinnier and exhausted. And some of them you will never see again. It was life of my parents and my little brother for 8 months. And it was life under Russian occupation. And in October, they decided to leave that territory. And for 3 months, they lived in the north part of Ukraine because it was safer. But last week, they decided to come back home. For me, it is hard to say that it's a safe place, because since November, Kherson is under Ukrainian control, but the struggle remains. And the city is attacked every day by Russia. And life under occupation is not life, it is survival. And unfortunately, many people are still under Russian control. But we all want to get our normal lives back. We all want to be free. And this is the reason why Ukraine is still fighting. And this is the reason why Ukraine doesn't give up. And that is the reason why Ukraine is asking for support from people from all over the world. Thank you.
Hi, I am Veronika, and I came to the United States in the middle of December, and I'm here to share with you my perspective on the war. But first, I want to tell you about our life in Ukraine before the war. There were a lot of changes, and it was time of much opportunity and economic growth. We were moving away from Russian influences in language, in media, and schools. We were building our new roads, our new schools, and we were restoring our architecture and culture. We had new opportunities for studying, for traveling and working. We were fighting corruption and trying to change the system overall. And that's what we wanted. We wanted to build our nation. We wanted to unite people around our independent Ukrainian culture and not Russian influences. And then suddenly in the middle of the night at 4 a.m., life changed. We were not ready. Our country was not ready. We were so scared and we couldn't protect ourselves. During the first days, we were hiding underground. We didn't know where to go. So we stayed underground with our backpacks, just hiding. People lost their jobs. A lot of people lost their homes and loved ones, parents, siblings, children, friends, and classmates. But then we stood together and started to fight back. In those first days, everyone in our neighborhood, including children, started to build barricades to protect people on our street. We filled sacks with sand and took tires from cars and put them at the entrance to the streets. On bigger streets, we had metal constructions and checkpoints. Even though we all understood that they would be destroyed with one shot of a tank, we still made it, and it made us stronger. Right now, a year later, the fight continues, and some people are raising money to support our people by playing checkers on the streets or painting and reselling weapon casings. With this money, they buy more weapons and protective gear for soldiers. And these brave actions motivate others to also contribute to the war effort. We want to continue to help our army more and more because we appreciate what they do for us. We know that we are alive only because they are sacrificing their lives for us every day. And this makes us stronger. Everyone, the elderly, students, children, is doing everything possible to help our army too. They are knitting camouflage nets, making energy bars, and collecting food. They are helping in any way they can. I spent a few months in a refugee camp as an interpreter and volunteer, and I know that everyone has experienced great loss and during this past year, and they want to contribute even if they are not able to contribute very much. This makes all of us feel like we are a part of the community, and this unites us and makes us stronger. This is a Dean Pavlakis building as it looked throughout my life. Growing up, I played many concerts, competitions, and festivals in these buildings. It is known as a cultural performing arts space. And then last year, suddenly, that changed, and the Dean Pavlakis building was bombed. It is located in the city center near hospitals and offices where many people work. As a result of this bombing, my friend didn't come back from a dentist appointment, and another friend's grandfather was killed on his way home. Also, a lot of children died that day. This is all so very tragic and so pointless and unjust. We don't want this war. We want to be free, secure, and independent. It is very difficult, but we in Ukraine are doing our best to hang on. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming. So, I never wanted to come to America, but I'm so grateful and thankful to be here now. My life in Ukraine wasn't perfect. I had the same question that your average 21-year-old girl faces every day. Will I have good grades? What are my plans for my future? What are my mom's plans for my future? And do these jeans make me look fat? Yeah, but on the 21st of February, my life changed forever. In this picture, we can see the university where I used to study. This place is ruined by Russian missiles. Russian missiles have broken and damaged my soul, much like they did to the building picture. I'm so honored and grateful to stand here and share my story, not only because I have an opportunity to continue my education here at Carroll, but I have the opportunity to tell Americans my story and why supporting Ukraine is so important.
To begin with, I want to say thank you, United States, for enormous support to Ukraine. Without American vehicles, we couldn't protect our territories and defend our independence. But unfortunately, we need more help and more support because Russia won't stop invading Ukraine today or tomorrow. And if successful, Putin will not stop at Ukraine. I hope that at the end of my speech, you will understand why Ukraine needs more vehicles. Almost every person who sits here may have a question. Why do we need support Ukraine? Because this is really far away from states. This is 1,000 kilometers, or as you say, miles away. So firstly, there is a humanitarian obligation to help Ukraine defend its territories. On February 18, 2023, Vice President Carroll College declared, in the case of Russia's actions in Ukraine, we have examined the evidence without legal standards, and there is no doubt these are crimes against humanity. Second, Ukraine needs American support so that we can prevent Russia from aggressively seeking to redefine its borders. On March 4, 2022, Belarus President Belarus President Lukashenko showed what looks like an invasion map. One of the arrows shows Russian forces moving from Odessa, it's in Ukraine. By the way, my mom lives there now because we can't go home. Into Moldova. Clearly, Russian plans reach further than Ukraine. As World War II showed, hostilities can often end the worldwide involvement and human catastrophe. Finally, the United States is seen throughout the world as a defender of democracy. Please understand that Ukraine is willing to spill blood to defend our democracy. However, we do need military and financial support against an enemy as powerful as Russia. Ukrainians are willing to sacrifice life in order to defend democracy. If our sacrifice stops Russian aggression, we will save countless lives, keeping the war from spreading. But with my personal experience, I don't want any innocent person here in America or in another country to be involved in the hell that Russia has already begun. I'm a witness of Russian crime and injustice. I have seen missiles that destroy civilian buildings. I have heard people screaming under the wreckage of the rubble. I have heard explode and start at night and continue until the morning without stopping. I have seen tears and fear in the eyes of Ukrainian people, and that is why I don't know anyone to see and feel what I have seen and what I have felt. Ukraine needs more weapons to protect the country and prevent Russia from invading Europe and throwing the United States into a worldwide conflict. At Carroll, watching a basketball game, I heard the expression that the best defense is a good offense. This is not just a sport expression. America has the opportunity to defend democracy, Europe, and possibility its own citizens by providing Ukraine the means to aggressively defend itself. In conclusion, I want to say that no one deserves to lose everything that you love, appreciate, and believe in. I believe that Ukraine must win because democracy and freedom must win. And also, I want to say a huge, enormous thank you to Ray Coons, to David Hunter and his wife, to President of Carroll College and his wife, teachers and advisors at Carroll, my host family, Erin and Rustin, Alana and Scott, students from Carroll, for an enormous support. I'm really grateful for everything that that you did for me, for Anzhela, for Veronika. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you.
Can we just say thank you again to our students and so who's first? Question. And I will come to you with the microphone so that you can ask your question. Oh, well, I hear from, we also have a couple of other thank yous tonight. Pat Christian, Dr. Pat Christian, sociology here at Carroll College, is taking care of the Zoom link in the chat. And Rachel Martin in academic technology is here, making sure that we have, technology.
So we have a question on Zoom. What would be the optimal military political outcome for Europe and Ukraine? Is Russia effectively winning by their ability to keep a grinding, destructive ground war and propaganda? Are Russian people actually this gullible or craven? How many men of military age are there actually available to keep compressing into service?
Who's gonna take that?
I guess I can start and let my compadres here join in. It's pretty clear that the optimal outcome, not necessarily a likely outcome, is for Ukraine to take back the territories that have been lost. And either militarily or through negotiations, create an arrangement for the Crimea. That is one of many possible outcomes. But it is an important one, and the implications are very broad. Since World War II, there has been a norm in world society that sovereign states do not attack each other to annex them or annex their territory. And on a number of notable occasions, the United States has led the effort to put back when that has been attempted, such as in Korea and in the Gulf War and Kuwait. If that norm is broken, then the opportunities for mayhem around the world are great. Now, a similar thing occurred in Europe between 1815 and the 1850s, 40 years where European countries didn't attack each other, they attacked countries around the world. And when that norm was broken with the Crimean War, Europe began suffering a cascading series of wars that brought us to the two world wars. So breaking this norm has tremendous implications. And the result of the war between Russia and Ukraine, therefore, has tremendous implications.
Yeah, I would just add, in addition, I mean, if we're talking optimal outcome here, again, as Dr. Pavlakis said, that doesn't necessarily mean likely. But in addition to Russian withdrawal from all of Ukraine's territories, I think I would add that an optimal outcome would be that the Putin regime would be no more and that Russia would become a liberal democracy. Again, not necessarily likely, but that would be optimal from the American perspective.
Part of the question was involved about what the Russian population thinks about what's going on. Very hard to know. As I mentioned, we don't have any accurate polling. There is anecdotal evidence that perhaps the Russian people are not, it's not like everyone agrees with Putin by any means. Certainly some people are very supportive. There certainly is anecdotal evidence that may be overreported just how many people agree with the war. But I'm sure there's a wide spectrum of opinion in Russia. And certainly people are very capable of believing what they wish to believe. That's what I can say about gullibility.
Well, we have two questions here in front.
How much would you say we need to hear a Chinese-Russian alliance? I feel like I should be saying Sino-Soviet.
First?
Sure. And I don't want to terrify anyone. I don't. Certainly, we've seen halting steps towards greater cooperation between China and Russia over the past year since the war began. Right before the war began, you might recall China said it, what was the exact wording? Unconditional support for Russia, something like that. Then the war went badly initially for Russia. China sort of backed off a little bit. More recently, we're seeing China kind of ratchet up their support a little bit. If I'm being wildly speculative here, which I'm going to do, my sense, and this isn't really based on anything but my own speculation, but my sense is that if the Russian war in Ukraine had gone quickly and smoothly as Putin had hoped, I think we may well have seen China move towards Taiwan in the near term. I think that's more or less off the table at this point, in large part because of Ukraine's stiff resistance to the Russian invasion. I think we're maybe more likely to see political manipulation within Taiwan, the Chinese Communist Party trying to form kind of alliances among the Taiwanese themselves to kind of challenge the ruling structure there. So that would be a little more subtle than a D-Day style invasion of Taiwan. So yeah, I'm rambling a bit, but I think my fears of that kind of alliance or that kind of partnership were much greater at the outset of the war than they are now, if that is comforting.
The question was about a military alliance and cooperation. But we have to remember that the reason for Russia's satisfactory to the Russians economic performance, despite the sanctions and the cutoff of so much technology, has been because the trade ties between Russia and China, as well as Russia and India and a few other countries, but particularly China, have become much, much denser. And lots of things that Russia used to buy from the West, it is now buying from China. So these two countries are drawing closer and closer into each other's orbit, and that will have consequences down the road.
Thank you both. And then we'll get to another Zoom.
Thank you. I'm interested to hear Anna's view on how and will the Putin regime be removed and when, and if it is removed, will that affect Russian aggression towards Ukraine?
Oh.
I get to be the first to say this. I'm a historian. We don't predict the future. But the future is truly unknowable. There are ways in which one can imagine the Putin regime falls, and you've alluded to this, right? There's two sort of paths. One path is that his close cronies ease him aside to more effectively prosecute the war. The other is that he is discredited enough and his policies are discredited enough that the people who push him aside, whether his cronies or people a little further out, use that opportunity to stop the war on the spot. Would happen probably very quickly. It's going to happen. But either of those options, the likelihood is unknowable.
I'm a political scientist. I'm supposed to try to predict the future, except the problem was we didn't do that well in the 2016 election based on polling. So I think that's what it's worth. The one part I'll just answer is if he is removed, I think we will see somehow, whatever happens, I think we will see changes in Russian policy. I think we see such an authoritarian state that I think things really change depending on who the leader is.
We have another question from the Zoom. The Zoom sphere, yes.
Is the Ukrainian government itself having internal struggles to stay unified? There are articles about Zelensky having challenges to his authority and corruption, as well as internal Russian sympathizers. Is this real or exaggerated?
I've been following this pretty closely because you have to understand this about the Zelensky regime. Right. They don't call it a regime, democratically elected government. Zelensky was elected overwhelmingly on an anti-corruption platform, which before the war, he showed himself sadly unable to do much. And Ukraine, right up to the beginning of the war, was ranked as only slightly better than Russia on corruption indexes. We've already heard from our students that Zelensky and his predecessors did open up Ukrainian society as much more free than it was, but the rot in the government did not get cleared out. So the question of what's going on in the government regarding Zelensky moving on corruption, from my perspective as someone who's watched this, it is in fact a welcome step. The other questions are tougher to discern from the inside. Certainly, the concerns Zelensky expressed about some high-ranking government officials having certain sympathies for the Russian position. And he acted to deal with those. I think those were marks of a very decisive ruling. Those were a good sign, not a bad sign, similar to the moves against corruption. As far as stories about sniping and criticism in the government, it's very difficult in a free-ish society to maintain absolute unity. We don't even see Putin maintaining absolute unity, right, with his own allies attacking his defense establishment. So there are going to be disagreements in the government. I don't think at this point they rise to challenges to Zelensky's leadership. I think they are more about policy, but I'm just guessing.
Oh, we have a question in the back. Okay, I'm coming. Anybody want to yell out something?
Well, while Dr. Fregulia is going up, let me shout out a quote from a speech made last fall. Quote, "They do not want us to be free. They want us to be a colony. They do not want equal cooperation. They want to loot. They do not want to see us as a free society, but a mass of soulless slaves." You may think that is Zelensky, and it could be, right, describing the Russians. In fact, that is Putin describing the United States, thus projecting all his behaviors onto an external force. All right, there you go.
Thank you. I have two questions. One, you mentioned what the United States is doing to help Ukraine and what China is doing to help Russia. What are other countries doing to support either Ukraine or Russia during this war? And two, you mentioned earlier how China was watching this, and if they saw it would go smoothly, that they would probably think to themselves, oh, we should do the same thing at Taiwan. Do you think it's also likely that if this went by quickly, do you think there was at least as likely a chance for North Korea to do the same with South Korea?
Thank you. Good questions. Okay, you know what? Can you shout out the answers? There's a question here as well, and thank you.
Well,
Yeah.
I'll take the easy question, if you don't mind. The easy question is who's helping whom? Western Europe has been, and Central Europe have been pretty united in helping Ukraine to various degrees. Britain probably the most enthusiastic, but others have followed, most recently Germany with significant military aid. There are other countries that have sent various forms of humanitarian aid. That's pretty small scale. Who's helping the Russians? More a matter, well, who's helping the Russians? The Iranians, right off the bat, with military hardware. Turkey has been claiming to play mediator, and that mediation has helped get Ukrainian grain out to its markets around the world, but has been leaning in the Russian direction. There are other countries around the world. They recently had military exercises with South Africa, of all places. And when South Africa was asked about this, they said, we're neutral in the war, and we're happy to work with the Russians. So they are not a complete pariah in the world. They have friends helping him. They have other friends who are standing back and waiting to see what happens.
Yeah, so I would add to what Dr. Pavlakis said about, especially about European support for Ukraine, that I think this is one of the areas where Putin badly miscalculated. He badly miscalculated not only militarily about what the Russian forces were capable of in Ukraine, but he also, I think, expected the easy Russian conquest of Ukraine to further divide the West and further divide NATO, to weaken NATO. And quite the opposite has happened. NATO has come together and been more unified, I think, than we've seen in a long, probably since the Cold War. So that was a big mistake on Putin's part. In terms of North and South Korea, my short answer is no. I don't think that would have provoked or encouraged North Korea to take action against South Korea. And the difference is quite simple. It's the stance of the United States. When it comes to China and Taiwan, the United States' longstanding policy is strategic ambiguity. It's ambiguous on purpose. It's unclear to both sides, to both the Taiwanese and the Chinese, what the US would do if there were to be hostilities between China and Taiwan. When it comes to the Korean Peninsula, that's not the case. If North Korea attacked South Korea, bye-bye Kim Jong-un. So there you go.
Thank you.
Oh, it's on to me. Hello, Dr. Pavlakis. Just saying, this is making me miss Russian history class. That and the music. So this is kind of two questions, but we kind of talked about this in class about like Navalny and that stuff. So is there any other opposition to Putin that are being, I don't know, vocal that could perhaps no? Oh, that's what I'm thinking in my head. Okay.
Was at the beginning, there were people protesting. They were en masse in their tens of thousands arrested, and things quieted down. When it is against the law to refer to what's going on as a war, that will get you arrested. More significant forms of protests shut down.
Wow, that's convenient. So, and then also we kind of also talked about Zelensky hasn't really spoken about stepping down, kind of like how Churchill, he during World War II, he said, I will have an election after this, just let me get through this war. So is there any update on that? Whether, no, okay. Those are my questions, I guess.
You saw what happened to Churchill. He lost that election immediately.
The war leader is not necessarily a peace leader, and that's a sign of a healthy democracy.
He did come back.
Could probably do it about. Yeah, so I have a question. I'm looking around, I see a room full of young voters or potential voters. Just heard a plea from, the Ukrainian ones about providing support. What would you encourage these students to do in order to reach our political leaders? And then the second part of that question is, would Carroll be willing to put an online petition that we could sign in support of Ukraine?
Oh, okay. So I cannot answer the second question. I can work on the first question. I can work on the first question. That's beyond my pay grade. So the first question about what people can do. Certainly people should write their leaders, people should call, people should email what they think, people should write letters to the newspapers, people should feel free to express themselves, and you certainly should vote. Obviously, any one person, it takes a mass group of people, but do tell the leaders what you think, and certainly participate in the political process. When people do not participate in the political process, they really kick away their ability to have it's a small voice, but still your voice in the system. So just across the board, I encourage everyone to participate in the political process.
Okay, I'm gonna go here, John, and then in the back, okay? Okay, yeah, right, okay.
I have two questions. The first is Ukraine considering joining NATO, and why or why not?
What are the chances of Ukraine joining NATO?
Well, I'll say from the Ukrainian perspective, they are very interested in that prospect. Okay, because NATO is a mutual defense treaty. as when one is attacked, all are required, if requested, to go to their assistance. And that has been invoked once. Does anybody know when? After 9/11 by the United States, and everybody joined in the invasion of Afghanistan.
Yeah, so the short answer is yes, Ukraine is very interested, as Dr. Pavlakis pointed out. From the American perspective, it's very complicated. When now President Biden was vice president during the Obama administration, he said explicitly that the United States supported Ukrainian entry into NATO. Right now, of course, the complication is obvious. It's that Russia's actively at war in Ukraine. If Ukraine were to join NATO, does that automatically trigger World War III, right? So it obviously can't happen right now. Would it happen after the war? It kind of depends on the outcome of the war and what that means for all parties involved, for Russia, for Ukraine, for the United States and Western Europe. So I think it's definitely conceivable that it could happen 5-10 years down the road after the war, but certainly not in the immediate future.
This is more of a historically based question. So the failure of the League of Nations was kind of when we didn't do anything when Germany annexed Austria and a few other places. So like that policy of complacency and compliance. And then from the reverse side, the success of the United Nations was seen as the Korean War and our stepping up to defend South Korea. So would Russia's invasion of Ukraine and our failure to militarily involve ourselves be seen as a failure of the United Nations in the same way the League of Nations failed?
I'm happy to do the League of Nations, but that's a complicated answer that I don't think takes us where we need to go. So I think it's gonna be
Somebody, anybody?
I'll take it. All right. So
Somebody say
yes,
something.
Ethiopia. Okay, the failure of the League of Nations is not in the German annexation of Austria. It is in the League of Nations' failure to defend Ethiopia from Italian invasion and conquest. And that is when the League of Nations was revealed to be spineless, and the chief spineless players, Britain and France, then hobbled the League of Nations from that moment on. Right? They did not send aid to Ethiopia. They did not rally behind Ethiopia. They put on some extremely ineffective sanctions that they knew would be ineffective, and then sighed when Ethiopia was conquered. Now, later, once the war started, the main war started, Britain helped Ethiopia free itself. But that's later, not League of Nations. So the parallel is completely inexact.
And Dr. Pavlakis, I will see your Ethiopia and raise you a Manchuria.
Okay.
Because even before Ethiopia, Japan invaded Manchuria and the League of Nations did nothing. So nothing he said is incorrect, but there was this precursor to the situation in Ethiopia. I would agree that the parallels are hard to draw there. I suppose you could claim that the Russian annexation of Crimea in 2014 and the rest of the world's lack of action is something like what happened in the 1930s. But when it comes to this current phase of the war, the active phase of the war, it's very different. And in my view, the reason is quite simple. It's that Russia has thousands of nuclear weapons, right? So it's not that the West is doing nothing. It's not quite the same as appeasement in the 1930s. The United States and NATO have given and continue to give lots of military aid to Ukraine, but the danger of intervening directly with the possibility of a nuclear World War III are well beyond anything that we faced in the 1930s.
Okay, I'm gonna get John and this gentleman in the back, and then I'm gonna get to.
You don't have to give me.
Are you sure? I'm happy to come to you.
So it was made clear during, I believe, Dr. Johnson's piece of presentation that sanctions have not done a whole lot to stop Russia or create issues for them in this advance. The aid sent through humanitarian aid and weapons that the U.S. has been sending and that our NATO partners have been sending, and the rest of the UN, haven't seemed to do much from an outside perspective other than cause a stalemate instead of a steamroll. What next steps have you taken before direct involvement?
You want to go?
You wanted to. I mean, I'm not sure I would phrase it as direct involvement or, so, you know, as sort of a black and white choice. But when it comes to trying to envision the end of this war, short of Putin being overthrown or something like that happening, you know, we're seeing some talk from different countries about peace plans, right? China is going to be putting forth a peace plan. Zelensky, I think, has already kind of preemptively rejected whatever China has to say. So it's not immediately hopeful, but it's at least a small step in the direction of some kind of negotiated settlement. That's going to be complicated, and I'm sure Dr. Pavlakis can speak to that better than I could. But what's the status of Crimea going to be? What about the eastern provinces, Donetsk and Luhansk? What about the future membership of Ukraine in NATO? It's all of these questions are going to be very complicated, and the United States and Russia in particular are going to be diametrically opposed on them. So I don't know. I don't have a good answer beyond that, I guess.
I'm just not optimistic about any negotiated settlement. Let's deal with that.
And on the military side, you've probably been hearing about, but may not understand the import of the decision to send Leopard and Abrams tanks through Ukraine on a fairly large scale. This at a time when we think that half the Russian tank force has been obliterated. The countries helping Ukraine were nervous about sending that kind of weaponry a year ago because they were concerned that Ukraine might behave in unpredictable ways and, for instance, invade Russian national territory. That seems to be less of a concern, and these may provide an ability to break the military stalemate, but we don't.
In the back, please.
Yeah, if continued involvement on a more physical scale is realistic, is how much are we worried about a situation like we see in the Middle East where we end up getting bogged down and we have people trying to aid for decades? I mean, is that a realistic situation? And if it is it something that we as a nation should be willing to stand?
It's certainly possible. Oh, it's certainly possible. I'll let someone else. What should we ought to do as a nation?
As Dr. Pavlakis said earlier, we're historians. It's difficult to predict the future. My kind of knee-jerk reaction to the question is I think decades is hard to imagine. Years more likely. Putin has shown no indication of a willingness to back down in any way. I think this is likely to continue to be a slow grind, a slog. And depending on who's in office here in the United States, that aid is either going to continue to flow or not. We'll have to see what future elections have to say about that. But yeah, I can see this going on for several years, although decades, I'm not, that's too far out, I guess, for my field of vision.
There is a fiction book called The Air Affair, and one of the premises of that book is that the Crimean War, which was fought in the 1850s, in fact, never ended, and was still going on at the time the book was supposed to be taking place, which was in the 1990s. In a way, here we are with a new version of the Crimean War. And we just hope that it doesn't last for 140 years.
We have a Zoom question and then a couple people in the back.
I'm gonna cheat. We got, I'm gonna combine a couple questions that are very straightforward and then another one. So the straightforward questions are about how many Ukrainian soldiers, how many Russian soldiers, is there a draft? You know, can you say something about the fighting forces of the two countries? And then part two is, could breaking the norm by invading Ukraine lead to breaking the norm and using a nuclear weapon?
I'll start with the nuclear. One of the great concerns is, will Putin escalate to the nuclear possibility of nuclear weapons? I cannot answer that. I think it's something that always look. There's also a wide variety of what that actually means. How far that would go. It's something that's really concerned. That's just a great concern.
Yeah, while we're on the new question, then you can take the first question. Yeah, early in the war, I think there was probably more concern than there is now that Putin might make use of tactical or battlefield nuclear weapons rather than huge thermonuclear explosions. I think that concern has receded a bit for now, although the one red line that Putin seems to hold to is if Russian territory is threatened. So one wonders about Crimea specifically, because Putin considers that part of Russia. If fighting spills over into Crimea itself, if the Ukrainians try to retake Crimea, might that provoke Putin to cross that line? That's a great unknown.
So the Russians conducted the original invasion with about 160,000 men. Russia has since experienced about 160,000 casualties. And for anyone familiar with World War I, that starts sounding familiar, right? He claimed to have drafted 320,000 fresh troops, of whom it is believed a couple 100,000 are now on the 600-mile-long front. So the facts about the Ukrainian army are less known. And in the interests of supporting Ukraine, it's better that they not be publicized. But they're clearly in the realm of several 100,000 people, whoever is best.
As I'm heading to the back, I want to say something about Iran. Iran is the wild card in some ways in this situation, because what Iran decides to do, and right now they're providing drones, as you know, to Ukraine or to Russia, yes. That's destabilizing for the entire region, including our closest ally in the region, which is Israel. So I would, Iran is one to watch. I won't prognosticate, or predict, because I'm a historian, but history would indicate Iran bears watching and what they decide to do. And we've made them a pariah. So in some ways, we are at least partly to blame for that situation.
So I apologize, I know I'm not on the panel, and this is my mistake in the question. But for those of you that know me, my name is Beth Devins, you know that. I'm a counselor in the Wellness Center, clinical social worker. But I spent 24 years of my life in the Air Force, defending our nation's policy. And so there are three things that have come up in questions that I just kind of want to touch on for a second. One is, what can students do? What can we as individuals do to support democracy in other countries? One is, we're not held to the foreign policy or the national policy at a level where we can start World War III. But students at Carroll have already been supporting the Ukraine. A year ago, when this started, students from the Flex Theater and students in that community got together in our community in Helena and put on a benefit for the Ukraine by singing songs and telling stories through their music and raising, I think it was $20,000 to send directly to an individual on the ground in the name of a private fund so that they could go out and buy the supplies that they needed
to heal their wounded and to have bags to put sand into and whatever was needed. And so as individuals, we can come together to do a lot to help. With that, we also need to recognize the question of, are Russian people so naive to believe what they're being told? Well, perspective. Even in our own country, in the United States, one of the greatest democracies in the world, many things shape our perspectives as humans and as Americans about what's going on in the world. So Ethiopia has come up. We have international students here from Ethiopia that can tell of the same horrors that our Ukrainian students are talking about. But it's an internal conflict and not one that affects world wars because they're being invaded by another country. So what you can do is recognize how privileged we are to be in a country where we can stand up and say what's right and what's wrong. But recognize that it isn't always tied to national policy, it's about humanity. It's about recognizing that it is more than just one country in the world that's fighting for its own independence and democracy, and for just the privilege to live. So being cognizant of that will prevent us from being the Russian people we think are dopes for believing what their military and what their president is saying to them. Eyes wide open, with full hearts and full minds.
I have a question here.
So India has been described as one of the most important nations to bring into the Western orbit due to their opposition to China and their geographic relevance. However, India has maintained economic relations with Russia. How concerned should we be about this, and how much should America and NATO push back against India's behavior?
It's your world, so you go.
Who gets it?
Right, so India is a critical geopolitical player and one that has potential in various geopolitical situations, including the concern that exists around China, right? India has concerns about China as well. Indian soldiers and Chinese soldiers die with astonishing regularity, and most of us never hear about it on their shared border. India is also taking a turn that is concerning to many observers in the United States under its current president, who is a Hindu nationalist. And anybody who's taken my courses has a sense of what that means as defining who is in and out of the Indian community, including one of the largest Muslim populations in any country in the world. The growth of repression in this country, this democracy, this great democracy, is concerning to the United States. And in fact, the closeness that up until the war, India was exhibiting towards Russia and has continued economically to support Russia through this conflict. So there's a lot of concerns in a geopolitical sense about India's role here. And India is not, like any great nation, is not going to be anyone's patsy. But unfortunately, the path they're taking leads them further away from the ideals that the United States espouses.
Yeah, I would just add, one of the things, I teach US diplomatic history, which is the history of US foreign policy, and one of the things we talk about in that class is the frequent tension in US foreign policy between America's professed ideals and the realities, sort of hard realities of national interest. And I think this is a good example of that, where in terms of ideology, as Dr. Pavlakis laid out, India is moving in a very concerning direction that the United States does not want to support. On the other hand, geopolitically, they're a counterweight to China in the region. So which way that goes, again, depends on developments, some of which are outside of America's control, and some of which are determined by who we elect to hold office, so.
I think we have time for one more question. Oh, there she is, right
I
there.
don't think I need a microphone. I think I'm good.
You think so?
Okay,
And then
so-
maybe one more from Zoom. Excuse me just a second, Olivia, and then maybe one more from Zoom.
Can I go after her?
Yeah, that's what I mean. Yeah, yeah. It's all you, Olivia.
Okay, how big of an impact is US aid making? If we get to the point where the US has elected officials that are not willing to provide aid, what will happen to Ukraine and its movement? What will the continuation or discontinuation of US aid to Ukraine look like? I feel like we're not really told what this could look like or how big of an impact US aid is making, so I thought.
I think, as we mentioned, how important logistics and production are to winning the war. There has to be aid in order to win, in order for Ukraine to fight. Now, of course, there's not just the United States, there's the rest of the West as well, but if that aid was just all withdrawn, or most of it was withdrawn, it'd become very, very challenging, I think.
Yeah, if it got to the point that the US, for whatever reason, whether a new presidential administration, whether there's a standoff between President Biden and Congress, both of which are conceivable, right? If it got to that point where the United States, where the Biden administration or some future administration cut off aid, then it would all be on Europe. And America's NATO partners in Europe would really have to step up their aid. Would they have the capacity to do that?
It's a big question.
Is an open question. So, yeah, those are thoughts.
Nothing.
Okay, so here's how we're gonna roll. We have questions, or a question from Zoom. The penultimate speaker will be our esteemed president who wants to say a few words. Then as moderator, I get the final thank you.
Here's a question. Putin has seen NATO membership multiply by leaps and bounds toward their borders. Could a truce be made that would stop the growth of NATO that scares Putin in return for pledges to not attack NATO, an ultimate win-win?
I don't believe anybody will believe a pledge. I just don't believe that there's no credibility there. So I'm afraid we're sort of beyond that time.
A pledge from Putin.
A pledge from Putin. And yeah, a pledge from Putin, I just don't think there's a whole lot of credibility at this point.
And from the American perspective, multiple administrations are on record saying that anyone who wants to join NATO ought to be allowed to join NATO. I think that's a pretty firm principle that multiple administrations have laid out. Now, again, it's conceivable that some future administration might take a radically different approach towards NATO, like we saw a little bit under the Trump administration. But as long as we're within that sort of mainstream of US foreign policy history and commitment to NATO, it's hard to conceive of an American administration being willing to cut that kind of deal.
And from the perspective of Putin, the only thing that would be acceptable would be countries to leave NATO, the Baltics, Poland, etc. He's not going to make a deal just to not let Ukraine and Belarus in, not that Belarus wants to. That kind of deal doesn't make sense to him unless NATO withdraws and we kick countries out. The West will never do that. So it's really a question of Belarus, Ukraine, and Georgia. And by the way, as this war has dragged on, Georgia, which started out leaning towards Ukraine, has shifted and is leaning towards Russia, as Belarus has always done.
Thank you. Wow, this has been truly significant. I think this is one of the most, thank you. I think this is probably one of the most significant panels of this nature here in Montana, the Northern Rockies, possibly the country. And I just want to thank our history and political science departments and faculty for their leadership. And I especially want to thank our 3 Ukrainian students for
be willing to stand and tell us what you've experienced, what you believe, and what you hope happens. Let's give them an incredible round of applause. The question was asked about how can we support Ukraine? What are we doing to support Ukraine? And I would just like to broaden that to what is this community doing? I think these three students are a great example. These, our three Ukrainian students are here, and our four Ethiopian students are here because of the generous support of this community. Ray and Susie Kuntz, David Hunter, who played a huge role, the host families, individual donors, support for the Ukrainian students from the Gianforte Family Foundation, and many others. And I would like to ask if you or members in our viewing audience want to support this initiative, want to support these students in bringing additional students from countries like Ukraine and Ethiopia and other places, please feel free to reach out to our advancement department, and you can do that by emailing me at Carroll, or you could email me, president@carroll.edu. We are so excited to be able to help. And again, thank you so much, Dr. Pavlakis, Dr. Cash, Dr. Johnson, Dr. Fregulia. Thank you so much for all you're doing.
Final thank you for the expertise on our panel, for the powerful witness of our students. To one of our Ethiopian students who is here tonight, maybe she'll wave. And to all of your witnesses as well, for coming out tonight in the bitter cold to hear our panel and to hear the witness of our students. Thank you so much. Have a lovely evening.
Oh, I see.
Hi.